So far, the people of Israel had taken no active part in the gradual reopening of the path to Palestine. On the occasion of the first return from exile, when Persia was the intermediary power, they were ready as soon as King Cyrus gave the word, and they went back from Babylon, 40,000 strong, with their basins of gold, their vessels of silver, their servants, and their horses and camels. But then they were near at hand, and the separation from Zion had lasted only 50 years. The second exile had lasted for 1,800 years, and its people were scattered over every latitude of the globe, dulled by the desperate effort simply to stay alive, not to be absorbed, not to lose their identity. They succeeded, the only people on earth ever to retain national identity without a national territory, but at a grim cost. When the temple was pulled down, according to an old rabbinical legend, a splinter from its stones entered the heart of every Jew, and that stone in their hearts was their only country. These are some paragraphs written by Barbara Tuchman in the book The Bible and the Sword, describing two exiles. I love this framework for our topic we're going to talk about today, which is the making of modern Israel, the modern Middle East. Because for many Jews, the time between the destruction of the temple and the uprisings in the first and second centuries formed a second exile for the Jewish people, scattered across the face of the globe until they returned to their homeland in the middle of the 20th century, which is where we'll pick up our story today. This is Cole Fakes. I'm joined by Terry Fakes, and we are back on the So We Speak podcast, and we're talking about the making of the modern Middle East, and specifically understanding how do we make sense of Israel and its enemies, its combatants, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, modern day Iran. How did we get into this position, and how do we start to make sense of it? There's so many competing narratives and facts and ways of viewing this topic. We thought, let's cut through some of that with a little bit of history.
Absolutely. And, you can go way back in this story, for back into the 19th century and perhaps earlier, but maybe just to summarize how we get to the formative event of the forming of the nation of Israel. You and I were talking before the podcast about World War One and the British mandate in the area of Palestine, what we currently today call Israel or Palestine. There was a movement of the Jews to return after this long, centuries long exile that you just talked about. They really haven't had a home. They've been scattered. They've endured various persecutions. And there were two kinds of Zionism. Zionism is a name for the movement for the Jewish people to be collected back together. Of course, there's religious Zionism that would say God gave this specific land to our father Abraham, so we want to return to Israel. There were secular Zionists who simply said, well, we're not religious, but we agree that the Jewish people need a safe haven or a homeland. And so for decades before World War II, you see Jews moving back as they can to the land of Israel. And it kind of answers the question you brought up, Cole, is when Israel becomes a nation shortly after World War II, how did any of the Jews get there? And it was through this process of emigrating in the decades before that.
Well, this is one of those topics where it's hard to even find a starting point to talk about, because before you know it, you'll find yourself back in the first century and then have to,
Right.
cover 1,800 years. So we've decided to start after World War II, but it would be interesting, and maybe we'll do a prequel. Maybe we'll do this like Star Wars. We'll do a few episodes now, and then we'll come back and do the prequel. But it is interesting what a role the British and the French play in the making of the modern Middle East because of the aftermath of World War One. I mean, like you said, you have people even as early as the 1860s talking
Right.
about a homeland for the Jewish people to return to. But it really picks up steam when you have the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Of course, you've
Right.
got all the work that T.E. Lawrence has done in one of the most fascinating characters in modern history, for sure. All the work that he's done in the middle of World War One. You have the fall of the Ottoman Empire, pushing back the
Right.
Turks. You have the freedom of the Arab peoples. I mean, it's worthy of at least a Netflix miniseries, if they could be told fairly. But our story will start after that. And so I just wanted to make the point that people had been coming back to the Holy Land that we consider Israel today as a pilgrimage and as a return to their homeland far before World War II. And sometimes we talk about modern Israel as if it started precipitated by the Holocaust. And certainly modern Israel can't be understood without the Holocaust. But the
Right.
history does begin before the Holocaust. In fact, it had almost fizzled out. The Balfour Declaration, the promise of a homeland for the Jews in their native land, had almost fizzled out before World War II. And it is the Holocaust and the rearrangement of the Middle East that creates the opportunity for the United Nations to give a mandate for the Jews to return.
That's a really good point, Cole. Had uh, World War II not happened, it's questionable whether the state of Israel would be there today, but it did. And so it coalesced a large part of international opinion after the disclosure, if you will, of the murder of 6 million Jews. And so in 1947, November of that year, the UN voted on really what in modern language you'd call a partition plan. They actually took what we now think of as the state of Israel, and there was a very thin portion on the western side near the ocean that was going to be a Jewish homeland. And what we call today the West Bank and more was going to be an Arab land. And so that's actually what they voted for. And so the Jews then uh, waited because they knew that as soon as they declared statehood, meaning, yes, we're going to act on that UN declaration, that the Arabs had already signaled their intention to destroy them. So their first president, David Ben-Gurion, from November of 1947, formed his parliament, did the best they could to form their defenses, which was not very good. It was very much ragtag. This is a nation that came out of nothing. But on May 14th of 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the state of Israel, and the next day, 5 Arab armies invaded. So Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon invaded 5 armies from 5 different directions into this little thin slice of land that is the new Jewish state. And against all odds, even secular Jews will admit that maybe there really is a God because there's no way Israel should have been able to survive at all. And in fact, when the dust cleared, they not only had survived, but they'd actually expanded their borders to take over about 60% of that little Arab partition. So and the reason they did that was they realized immediately that their borders were not defensible. And so the fact that they miraculously won, they actually kept a little more land than what the UN had originally given to them.
Mm-hmm.
Israel calls this the War of Independence, and the Arab world calls it a very dark day indeed.
You know what's interesting about this list is obviously the harrowing odds that were facing Israel. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't really have a military force. We think today of Israel as having a very stout ability to defend itself, but that was not the
Right,
case in
right,
1948. The other thing that's interesting about this list is, you list Egypt from the south, Jordan from the north, Syria from the north, Lebanon, and Iraq from the east. But you don't have the two major players in the Middle East today, Iran and Saudi Arabia.
right,
And one of the things that's interesting about that is the Middle East outside of Israel has shifted since this time. Really, it's not just the making of modern Israel. The entire Middle East, arranged as it is both very ancient, people in their traditional places they've been for thousands of years, but the governments and the territories and the alliances are relatively new within the last 60 years. And so in our second episode, we'll get to things like the Arab Spring. We will talk a little bit about why Iran is the way it is today.
right.
We will talk a little bit about why Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states are the way they are today. But it's just interesting to look at this list and say a lot has changed since 1948.
That's a really good point, Cole, because of those 5 nations back in 1948, 3 of them are effectively failed states who are controlled by someone else. Lebanon, controlled by Hezbollah, Syria, controlled by Russia and Iran, and Iraq, largely controlled by Iran. The other 2 states, Jordan and Egypt, both have while they don't have full diplomatic relations with Israel, they don't have conflict and haven't had conflict for some time. And we'll see why in a little bit. But you're right. The entire axis of anti-Israel sentiment has shifted.
The other thing that I think we have to start with is what was the situation in the land when Israel declares its statehood? We've talked, Jewish people have been returning, they've been settling. But one of the biggest questions today that people ask about is, well, what about the narrative that Israel comes in and they effectively colonize this people group that lived there called the Palestinians? That's their land, and Israel came in and took it, right? Or is that
Right.
not right? What happened with that narrative?
That's a really great question. Who are the Palestinians? And so let's just go back to who was in this land that we now call Israel. Who was there before the UN mandate in 1947? Well, actually, everyone who was there was basically a Jordanian citizen. Jordan controlled that area when the British moved out. And so Jordan, the people there considered themselves Jordanian citizens. They were a very mixed group of people. You have Arabs, you have Iraqis, you have Jordanians. I mean, these people are ethnically different. They're all probably Muslim, but they're not necessarily all ethnically the same. So it's a very mixed group of people. They did not, Cole, think of themselves as with an identity. The word Palestinian would have meant almost nothing because they weren't a coherent people group. They were Jordanian citizens. There were groups of Jews there who had bought land from some of the sheikhs and started these little co-ops called a kibbutz and get a foothold there. They were living in rough peace with their neighbors. In other words, it was a little bit like the Wild West. Nobody was totally in control, but Jordan had claim to that area. So today we think of it as a native group of people called the Palestinians. I'm going to suggest to you that the Palestinians, that idea of a group of people who have a national identity, didn't really come about until the 1960s and the PLO and Yasser Arafat. So at this time, there were a mixed group of people. Jordan claimed control over the area. When the UN came in with this mandate, Cole, they knew that they were going to disrupt the people who were there. But they weren't really disrupting a nation. They were simply saying, look, we've got a piece of land here. We've got some inhabitants there now. We've got some Jews there now. So what we're going to do is to solve this problem, we're going to carve it up into two pieces. And I'm sorry, if you are living there today and you're in the Jewish piece, you will have to move. And if you are a Jew and you own land in the piece that's not Jewish, you will have to move. And so, Cole, this did generate the modern idea of displacement of the native inhabitants. It would be, in my view, anachronistic to say displacement of the Palestinians, but it did displace the people that happened to be living there at that time.
There's a category error here between ethnic Palestinians and geographic Palestinians. We
Right.
think of Palestinians today because of these narratives in terms of an ethnic group of people who are Arabs in some sense, but the name of that entire area, basically under the British mandate, is Palestine. And so Jordan plays an interesting role in this story because in order to understand why Jerusalem is the way it is now,
Right.
we talked a few episodes ago when we were talking about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, why you have this family that has this key to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Yes, maybe we do believe that some of it goes all the way back to Saladin or whoever gives this key 800 years ago. But the reason the family has the key now has a lot more to do with why Jordan has been involved for so long in
Right.
disputes about who controls what in the Holy Lands. And we'll get to this more when we get to the Six-Day War, but part of it is because they were the ones in control after the British Mandate. And so that's why
Yeah.
they're, character number two in the story is because pre-UN declaration, if you want to know what was going on in the land, you have to look to Jordan.
That's exactly right, Cole. As a matter of fact, if right before the War of Independence for Israel in 48, uh, Jordan controlled Jerusalem. They controlled the Temple Mount where the mosques are. And by the way, that's why today Jordan technically still controls the Temple Mount, the mosque. Now, obviously Israel controls security on who can get in there, and you can't have guns. But Jordan controls the Temple Mount. If you go to Israel today and you want to go visit the Temple Mount, the Jordanian Waqf, WAQF, that little organization, they can close the Temple Mount anytime they want to. But that goes all the way back to the fact that Jordan was in control of this area. In fact, if you were a Jew living in that area at that time, you weren't allowed to go to the Western Wall because it belonged to Jordan and they didn't want Jews there. So you're
Hmm.
right. Jordan plays a bigger part of this than most people think.
So after this War of Independence, Israel miraculously throws off the surrounding armies, and then they live happily ever after this, correct?
Exactly. For a little while. Obviously, the Arabs are humiliated and the Arab pride is really bruised. And this is a real issue. And so they go back and lick their wounds. And uh, Nasser, Abdel Nasser, becomes the ruler of Egypt. He realizes they need to modernize. And so he begins an affiliation with the Soviet Union. This is during Cold War time now, think 60s. And so in the Cold War, Soviet Union says, hey, we'd like to make all these Middle Eastern Arab states our client states. We want their oil. We'll give them weapons. We'll help them destroy Israel. So he goes back and begins building that coalition. In the meantime, Yasser Arafat, who is a remarkable individual, in my view, an evil individual, he killed an awful lot of people and was a terrorist, but he was successful on the world stage of representing himself and his organization, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, as the representative of a group of people called the Palestinians. In my view, Cole, he created the Palestinians. He basically gave an identity to those people and became the negotiator for them. And throughout his career, he basically conducted terror wars against Israel, getting support from the other Arab countries to fund him and become their tool for fighting Israel while they rearmed. And so the PLO that still exists today. In fact, the PLO is the governing authority in the West Bank today. So what started in 1964 as an anti-Israel movement has evolved today to the governing authority of the West Bank.
You see this a lot in the news today because you have, in some sense, uh, well, I guess from some certain perspectives, you have a unified group of people, known as the Palestinians, who live in the West Bank and in Gaza. And as we've seen recently, these actually are not the same groups. They have similarities and they
Right.
have certain allied commitments. But the PLO in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza actually have pretty different genealogies back to this time. And so, talk a little bit about how the PLO has acted over the years and how they've progressed from this early movement in the 1960s up to ruling the West Bank today.
That's a great question. I'll kind of summarize it, but Yasser Arafat made himself, on behalf of the Palestinian people, an international figure. And so he began a reign of terror. And many of our listeners are not old enough to remember this, but things like bombing school buses with Israeli children on them, literally a terror campaign against Israel. It was quite intense. Finally, Jimmy Carter, fast forwarding 1993, the Oslo Accords. This is where you get the Israelis together with Yasser Arafat, and they signed the Oslo Accords in 1993. That's where Arafat begrudgingly admitted Israel's right to exist, and the PLO was acknowledged as negotiating for and ruling the Palestinian people. And so then the uneasy relationship began for maybe a possible two-state solution. However, from 2000 to 2005, Yasser Arafat declared intifadas, meaning uprisings against Israel. So this was never an easy relationship between the two. In fact, in 2018, the PLO recanted and no longer accepts Israel's right to exist. Today in the West Bank, the PLO is the partner with Israel to govern. The PLO actually governs much of the West Bank. Mahmoud Abbas, whom you probably remember that name from the news, was elected the president of the PLO in 2004. And Gee, they never happened to have another election. So for the
Yeah,
past 20 years,
you
he's
hear
been
he's
leading
in
the
year
PLO.
18 of a 4-year term.
That's exactly right. So the PLO has merged into less of a terrorist organization, certainly not a friend to Israel, but has realized that terrorism was not getting its aims, and it has become more of a political organization. However, the big problem with the PLO, Cole, is that the Palestinians through the PLO receive billions of dollars in international aid, but the the livelihood of the people in the West Bank have not commensurately improved. And so the PLO has been riven with corruption and its inability to rule well, its inability to provide a good life for those in the West Bank makes many people today question whether they could be a partner in a two-state solution. And I think the
Hmm.
general consensus is that they can't.
Well, you saw from early on that Netanyahu is down on the idea of a
Right,
two-state solution in general, but certainly that the PLO was going to be the kind of watch care government over Gaza was not an appealing solution, I think, to anybody in Israel. It's interesting when you're in Israel and you go into the West Bank. So you think the West Bank, if you want to go to Bethlehem, for example,
right,
you have to go there, and you can go there. That's the thing. You can go there, and you still are in Israel, but you're in a different arrangement for how it's governed. The difference is pretty obvious when you get into the West Bank. You do not think to yourself, "Oh, there must be huge stimulus money coming into this place because it's so nice."
right,
It's culturally different. You can tell the government is different, but there are Christians there, Arab Christians. You have, I guess, some Jews probably that are there, but not very many. And then you have many, many, many Muslims who are there, and they're living. The West Bank is not very big. They're living just a few miles away, but in kind of
right.
a separate, I don't know, enclave is what you might call it within Israel. I don't think there's another arrangement quite like this in the world where you have a government that is completely and totally opposed to the government that actually rules over it in such close proximity under the care of another country. It's a very strange way of doing something, but it's because you have this long, complicated history of
Right.
antagonism and cooperation between the PLO and Israel.
That's exactly right. The West Bank today is the result of evolution, and honestly, evolution in a positive sense. I mean, leaving aside the current difficulties, there have not been tremendous problems by Middle Eastern standards between Israel and the West Bank. I mean, there are obviously issues, but in the big scheme of things, that has been relatively stable for some time. But back to our story. In 1964, the PLO begins. They begin their terrorism. They represent the Palestinian people. In the meantime, President Nasser of Egypt has rearmed with Soviet help, and so has President Assad in Syria. And Egypt and Syria make what they believe is a secret plan in 1967, so we're about almost 20 years later. In 1967, they make a secret plan to simultaneously invade Israel, Egypt from the south, Syria from the north, and wipe them off the face of the earth. Abdel Nasser has visions of grandeur. He sees himself as the father of the new Arab, pan-Arab alliance, that he's going to defeat Israel. He's going to be the number one guy in the whole Arab world. And so, right before they plan to attack, Israel realizes that the attack is coming. Israel realizes that they are not very defensible and that they could lose. So they preemptively strike both Syria and Egypt, and they catch the air forces on the ground and almost completely destroy the Egyptian and Syrian air force. And then ensues what's called the Six-Day War, which Israel wins decisively in 1967. Two things come out of this, Cole. Number one, Israel in the north keeps the Golan Heights. So today, if you look on a map, it'll be called occupied territory. And this is why. It used to be Syria, but in 67, Israel realized these guys can attack us from there anytime they want to. So they pushed the Syrians back, but they kept that piece of land called the Golan Heights. In the south, they pushed the Egyptians back and kept the whole Sinai Peninsula, saying you're going to have a hard time invading us when you have to come all the way across the Sinai Peninsula to do it. In the middle of this, kind of a side note, Jordan got involved, didn't want to, but did. And as a result of Jordan getting involved, Israel pushed into the east and took what's today the West Bank. So Israel at that time, with their preemptive strike, was able to enlarge their territory to what they believed would be defensible boundaries. Pretty much what you see is the nation of Israel today. But Cole, this explains why, if you flip it around from the Arab point of view, and today from the UN's point of view, hey, maybe they were going to attack you, but you struck first. And that's
Mm-hmm.
why on most maps you will see the West Bank and the Golan Heights marked as occupied territory.
It's interesting in our lifetimes. This is a long term narrative.
Mm-hmm.
In the scope of history, obviously, it's very short. But this explains a lot of the terminology and the narratives that you hear in kind of the competing views on Israel, the
Right.
rightness or the wrongness of Israel. So when you hear things like Israel is an apartheid country, it's occupying, it's colonizing. This is where the narrative goes back to. Now, there are things in between that, once you start on pulling on that thread, you'll see a certain scope of events fall into that category. But this is really one of the major sticking points, it seems to me, between the narratives about Israel, is if we're going to set aside for a moment just pure anti-Semitism, the streaks
Right.
of the radical Islamic world that want Israel wiped off the map. If you set that up, if you set that off for just a second, the question as to whether Israel is a colonizer or not essentially comes down to whether you think they were justified and right in their intelligence, or if they think they were cynical and looking for an opportunity to strike their neighbors. And people come down differently on that. I think the evidence is pretty clear that they preempted an imminent invasion and strike. I think you saw something basically like October 7th coming, but with bigger
Right.
armies, and they
Right.
decided to act first. But what you'll hear sometimes in the media, and when you hear people talk about this, sometimes you'll hear them say Israel was looking for an opportunity to take land from their neighbors. And so they did strike first. And I think that's where some of these different narratives come from. And, we're looking at 50 years of developing these narratives now. So they're pretty entrenched. It's going to be very difficult to reframe this at this point.
That's a really good observation, Cole. I'll give you my view on this. First of all, is Israel imperialistic? I would say no. And the reason I say no is that during the 67 war, Moshe Dayan was the general for the Israeli forces. That 6 Day war, they quickly overwhelmed the Syrians and the Egyptians. The road to Damascus, the capital of Syria, was literally 30 miles away and open to the Israelis. They could have occupied the capital of Syria. And the same is true of Cairo, but they stopped. And I think the reason they stopped, in my mind, has always been, and historically, I think it bears this out, Israel is not interested in conquering its neighbors. Second point, holding on to the Golan Heights and holding on to the West Bank. I do think there's a difference of opinion here. One would be there are Israelis who believe this is our land, God promised it to us, and we're going to take it. Now we'll stop there, but we're going to take it. A second point of view is, well, but there are other Israelis who say, look, it's not so much about it being God giving it to us. We just need defensible borders. And so the borders they have today, keeping the Golan Height, keeping the West Bank, they can actually have a hope of defending their nation. So on the second issue, you could say, well, these are religious Jews that are going to take over what they consider the promised land. Or you could say these are secular Jews who just want a nation that can be defended. And I understand people may have different opinions on that.
Well, there wasn't peace for long. You're going to see the same nations with a different cast of characters strike again here in a few years. And one of the most interesting players to emerge in the conflicts with Israel is Anwar Sadat, another remarkable individual for good and bad reasons. And he's going to lead his country to take another run at Israel shortly after this.
Exactly. 6 years later, 1973. So the Egyptian president Nasser is dead. Anwar Sadat is the new Egyptian president. Anwar Sadat, now we're into the era of the US and the Soviets. Think Nixon and Kissinger, think the Soviet Union. They are in a Cold War and they're both battling for influence in the Middle East. Well, Anwar Sadat realized he is a very visionary individual. He realized that Egypt had failed twice to achieve their aims by force of arms, and that trusting the Soviets and Soviet military technology had not worked. But he had the problem of course, a hatred of Israel, which was rampant in the Arab world. But he had the problem of how can we uh, come to some kind of terms when we've been humiliated twice in war? So he also conspired with the Syrians, but successfully, to launch a surprise attack 6 years later, 1973, the holiest day of the year in Israel. And by the way, that date is 6th of October, 1973. Now, hold your thought on that. That's not a coincidence. But 6th of October was Yom Kippur that year. It moves around in the Jewish calendar. And so when all the Jews were basically at military low levels, he had fooled their intelligence. They attacked and they almost overwhelmed Israel. But you know what happened? This is really interesting in reading the analysis. Anwar Sadat's armies invaded the Sinai Peninsula and pushed the Israelis back and stopped. Now, as this played out from the 6th of October to the 25th, basically, Anwar Sadat had never intended to destroy Israel. I don't know if he thought that they could or if he really intended to. What he wanted to do was restore Arab pride by having a military victory. And then he wanted to come to terms with Israel. Basically, that is the way it worked out. Afterwards, he came to terms with Israel. I'm not saying that he said, "We love you, we're brothers," the past is gone and forgotten, but he normalized relationships with Israel and he had restored Arab pride and brought an era of peace. He was assassinated for doing that by Islamic elements that weren't willing to make a rapprochement with Israel.
I say he was viewed as a traitor by many,
Yes.
but certainly as a success by others, a complicated figure. In fact, I think in Henry Kissinger's last book before he died, he's got a whole chapter on Anwar Sadat and his legacy. Of course, he was working with him during this time period, but very, very complicated time. And what do you think? Because now when you think about the antagonists to Israel, Egypt is not among the most
Right.
antagonistic. Certainly, we've heard a lot about Egypt because they share a border with Gaza, and there's a corridor there where a lot of weapons and things have come in. So they're clearly not best friends. But if you had to describe the trajectory of Egypt after Anwar Sadat, was that the turning point for Egypt and Israel?
Yeah, I think it was Cole. I think from that time on, again, it didn't mean that Egypt now became a friend of Israel. But what happened was Anwar Sadat made it clear and realized that Egypt was not going to attain its goals by military force. He restored Arab pride and made it okay to settle into an uneasy co-relationship. And so from that time until basically today, both Jordan and Egypt have had, relatively speaking, quiet relationships with Israel. You don't see attacks and attempts to destroy Israel by those two. I think they learned their lesson then and had a turning point.
Which we'll come back to their involvement with Israel in the next episode when we talk about the Abraham Accords. But those turning points become interesting for the framework leading up to the Middle East today. Now, in the middle of this, you've basically got 25 years of Israel being attacked by their neighbors. You
Mm-hmm.
still, at this point, have no one willing to live and let live with Israel among these nations that have attacked them. And at the same time, you have a proliferation of terrorist groups, some of which are the major players in the Middle East today. How did Hezbollah, for example, figure into this, and then Hamas? Those are the two that we hear the most now. And I think the question people ask is, how did these groups get the control that they have? How did they get so ingrained in the areas they're in? Well, that was all happening in this time period, correct?
Exactly. And let me cue that up for our next episode, if you will. But remember where we are. 1973, there have been three wars: 1948, 1967, 1973, and the Arab countries have not been able to achieve their goals militarily to destroy Israel. Even with the help of the Soviet Union, with the U.S. coming in on the side of Israel and beginning to supply it with technology, they realized we're not going to be able to militarily destroy Israel. And so you see the end, if you will, of state versus state conflict with Israel. But of course, the Islamists aren't going to give up. And so the conflict takes a new shape. It now becomes non state actors. They're supported by the state, but it's not the army of Egypt that's going to attack, it's the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not the country of Lebanon it's going to attack, it's Hezbollah. And so in this next phase, in the early 1980s, you see the rise of Hezbollah and Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood and the continuation of war against Israel by different means.